You are listening to The Art of Sales. Everyone sells every day, and this is your source for conversational, real-world sales and prospecting methods that you are comfortable using and that get results. You'll help people buy instead of pushing them into being sold. Here's your host, Art Subcheck.
Hey everybody, and welcome. Today's very special guest is Dan Hoemke, and he's going to share with us valuable sales knowledge, both from the perspective of being a high-level and top-producing sales professional, and as a C-level executive, the person that most salespeople would love to speak with, right? Dan has over 25 years of experience in a variety of levels and functions, primarily in the healthcare and insurance industry, corporate sales, management consulting, and serving in a variety of C-level roles. And very notably, he was the guy, that's right, serving as the Western U.S. President and CEO for Humana Healthcare. Today, Dan is Chief Business Officer for Base Health, a Silicon Valley healthcare analytics company, and serves in a variety of advisory and consulting roles, helping to build high-performing sales and account management organizations. Now, on a personal note, full disclosure here, Dan and I used to be neighbors, and we're recording this in studio, the studio being my home office, which is just steps away from my kitchen, where we have cooked hundreds of meals. Dan is an amazing cook, and I can cook a little bit myself. So maybe we should just start with recipes, Dan.
That'd be a good way to start, Art. Actually, it's odd coming into the house without there being any great fragrances in the air today. So you haven't been cooking yet.
Yeah, or you carrying a bunch of stuff, or us having cocktails, but maybe that'll come later.
True that.
All right. Well, Dan, again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And I like to have guests on the show that are maybe just a little bit different than your typical sales guru. And this is going to be one of the most unique perspectives that we have, and probably one of the best, because we're going to be talking to somebody who not only has done it at a high level, but also was on the other side of the desk listening to salespeople. So, Dan, before we get into the specific advice and tips you have for sales pros, give us a little bit of background. Tell us how you got into sales. Start there. How did you first get into sales?
Yeah, so thanks, Art. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure being here and a chance to visit with your listeners. It's like a lot of careers. You take kind of a circuitous path, and it's always kind of interesting to reflect back and think about how you got here. But I actually started out, basically wanting to be in the healthcare and the clinical, arena. Came out of graduate school with some very specific training in gerontology. Had the good fortune of meeting somebody early in my career that gave me an opportunity to start working actually in some of the very early days of corporate wellness programs, where I was going around the United States and working with companies like Campbell Soup and those sorts of organizations, and ultimately got recruited by Mercer. Some of your listeners might be familiar with them as the largest benefit consulting firm in the world today, and initially started out as an analyst, and eventually moved into consulting and sales roles as the result of my experience there.
Did you have any sales jobs prior to that in high school, college?
Well, actually, I did. It's kind of funny you mention that, because I did throughout pretty much my college years. I actually worked. I sold men's clothing. Was one of my first opportunities to actually be in a sales role, and I learned a lot actually from that experience.
So what was one of the best things that you had learned selling men's clothing? Well,
at the time, I think the biggest thing is being able to actually relate to the people that you're working with. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about you, it's about the customer's concept. And I think very early on, I had the good fortune of a couple guys that said, hey, that's what you really got to understand if you're going to be successful in any business, really.
I'm always impressed with the guys at Men's Warehouse, because you'll go in and it's kind of like going into Costco. You walk in there looking to buy a shirt, and you walk out with a suit, a couple ties.
Totally. But again, it comes back to the fact that they spend a good deal of time with you, get to understand you, and they make it very easy, frankly, to add value to what you're trying to do.
So you mentioned you started out as an analyst, but then you moved into sales. How did you decide to make this a career? What was that moment where you said, hey, I'm really good at this. This is for me?
Well, I think part of it is particularly being with a consulting firm, that is working with clients all the time and essentially advising them. Is, if you think about it, I mean, that's a big portion of what sales is all about. And actually, it's interesting. At the time, I recall going through an early program with a company. Again, some of your listeners may recall a company called Wilson Learning out of Minnesota, and they had a great program called Counselor Selling, and it really fit with being a consultant who's not only trying to advise, but ultimately you're trying to expand your relationship, add more value, and look for, frankly, new ways to sell them, new services.
It's interesting, and I remember Wilson Learning, and it's interesting today where everybody's looking for the next new thing or the next shiny object, when really you look at it, the things that were taught in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, as far as consultative sales go, they're as much or even more relevant today than even they were back then.
I couldn't agree more, Art. I think what amazes me, and in addition to the role I have with Base Health over the years, I've worked with a lot of major corporations around the United States, particularly as working with them on larger, complex enterprise level selling, and it just absolutely amazes me. And I've seen this in everything from United Healthcare's to 3M to big Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, where everyone still retreats back to the thing that's easiest, and that is to go out and throw up all of your clients by pitching them your solution. Because frankly, it's a lot easier to pitch from a deck than it is to actually sit down and have a conversation.
You've never made that mistake, have you?
Well, Art, I can give you actually my best. It was probably one of my more sobering moments, but it was also a great opportunity to learn. And by this time, very honestly, I was well on my career. I'd left Mercer by this time. I was with MetLife. I was actually a vice president with MetLife at that time in their national accounts organization. And we had an opportunity to pitch, and I use that word very carefully here, to pitch General Electric. And General Electric, some of their executives were coming in from their Stanford offices to 1 Madison Avenue in New York City, and I was the guy. And honest to goodness, I think of it almost as rolling me out like Hannibal Lecter in a cart, and I'm the guy that's going to pitch him. And oh man, we had a presentation, and Art, I can tell you, I had him in the palm of my hands. And the reason I knew that is because I just knew how good I was in terms of this pitch I was making. And we had a break and went to the men's room, as you oftentimes do, and I was washing my hands at the sink, and one of the guys from General Electric was next to me. And of course, and if you think about this is so foolish, is that I asked him at that point, I said, so how are we doing? I said, are we hitting on the things that are important to you? And he stepped back as he's drying off his hands, and he said, no. And I actually thought he was kidding, because that's not possible. I was so good. I mean, I was like Eminem, Wayne Newton up there, or whomever else, right?
How could this be?
How could this be? And he said, no. He says, you keep telling us all these great things we need to know about MetLife, and you don't know anything about General Electric. And boy, I'll tell you what, it made for a very sobering and uncomfortable meeting the rest of the meeting. Needless to say, we did not get the General Electric account. Although I will tell you, I did come back in another life when I was running National Accounts for Pacific Air and did win the General Electric account. And I went on from, what's interesting is I went on my career at MetLife, and that was a great learning experience. And at that time, again, I ended up going back and taking another course. This is old days. It was Miller Heiman, some of the Miller Heiman stuff, consultative selling and that sort of thing. And I went on to sell the Walmart account by, frankly, talking about 10% of the time and listening about 90% of the time, but also learning how to ask really good questions and frankly, understanding. One of the things I remind people all the time is, you're not just asking questions to give people the appearance that you care. You're asking questions to actually learn some things that you can use to advance the discussion and really build a solution. And I got the Walmart account, got promoted to senior vice president, and have continued to try to put those things to use.
That's a great story, and actually I have told that story about you many times in seminars, because it is, of course I have my own that I've shared with listeners, but and again, you're not alone. Most everybody out there, I think, has experienced something like that. And probably losing that was more beneficial to you than getting it, because you learned such a lesson from it.
Totally. I mean, in so many different ways. I think one of the byproducts of it as well is that when you learn to be more effective in engaging people, you also inherently have an obligation in terms of advancing what you're trying to do in that discussion. And I think it really is an empowering type of thing, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's always been kind of my mantra, is that I am never going to put a proposal on the table, so to speak, that's not worthy of your consideration. And the other thing that I think is so important about it is that when, and I believe that, again, certainly in the enterprise level, the more that you can do to create discussion drafts of proposals, as an example, or the value prop that you're trying to sell, the more that you can use that in a discussion basis where you're both sitting down and discussing it, the more customer fingerprints you get on the solution, so that ultimately by the time that you're presenting your final proposal with the final numbers, there's no surprise. The customer's fingerprints are all over it. But it takes that ability to engage them to be able to get that far.
That's one thing I've taught for a long time, and that is let the customer write the proposal for you. And that comes as a result of just asking great questions, sharing little tidbits along the way, and mentioning to them, is this something that would work for you? Is this something that you'd be interested in? And speaking of proposals, we could probably do another episode on this, where so often I'll see salespeople too early say, can I send you a proposal? Where, of course, they're nowhere near to that point yet where it would be even relevant. And in other cases where decision makers use it as a way to try to get somebody off the phone to blow them off, saying, well, send me a proposal. And one of my favorite answers to that is, are we to that point yet?
Boy, I couldn't agree more. It is so funny you say that, because I just came from a meeting today with a company with whom Base Health is partnering, and they got an opportunity to have some very insightful discussions with one of the major insurance carriers out here in Arizona. And it's so funny because they wanted to get together today because they said, they said they were so excited because the folks that they recently met with said, send us a proposal. And in meeting with them today, I challenged them that, frankly, what kind of proposal would you possibly be selling them? And that all, happens all so often that, frankly, you are essentially pitching or sending a proposal to a client with whom you have no relationship, have no understanding ultimately of how your solution connects to their core business, and then you expect actually to be delivering something of value. And it's preposterous.
I got out of the request for proposal business probably about 30 years ago when I was young in my first couple of years of business. And I got one from, it was called US Sprint at the time, the predecessor to Sprint, the long distance company. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be the career maker for me. And I spent hours upon hours putting a proposal together. And I should have noticed that in the request, it said the winner will be notified by mail. No phone calls accepted. Now, of course, I just dismissed that. And then I'm thinking, well, obviously I'm going to be the best choice here because I had just come from the long distance business, sent the proposal, and of course got a letter saying that, no, you did not get the business. Well, naturally I was disappointed and a little bit pissed. So I contacted them, despite the fact that they said no phone calls will be accepted. I did get the person on the phone, and the first thing she said was, well, we said no phone calls were accepted. And I said, well, I understand that. However, I put a lot of time into this. I'm just kind of curious, was this already pretty much awarded before anybody even sent you a proposal? And she sheepishly said, well, we do have a vendor that we've been working with. I said, so really you just needed to go and get a couple of proposals? She said, yeah. So kind of like your story, lesson learned in that case. Total cannon fodder. And, it happens all the time. I know we're talking a little bit about kind of the C-suite and enterprise level, kinds of relationships. And that happens all the time. And of course, it's happening even more frequently as they develop procurement departments that actually take, business needs and then they go out and, market and that sort of thing. But similar story, it's interesting. I share with you about how I won the General Electric account ultimately. When I went to Pacific Care, I headed up their national accounts division for quite a few years. And we received an RFP from a consulting firm that was representing General Electric for, at that time, their Medicare business for their retired employees.
And I recall getting the RFP, and of course our people were all excited. Oh my God, we got this wonderful RFP from General Electric. And my response to them is that, I'm looking at this RFP, and as you look at them, I mean, they're filled with all kinds of words. It might be things, well, we're looking for quality or we're looking for this. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means. What does that mean to you? Mm-hmm. And I recall I actually called the consultant and I said, we are very interested. We think, that we may have something to offer here. Would you be kind enough to facilitate a discussion directly with the client so that we really could learn a lot more about some of the things that they are, representing in their RFP? Of course, they wouldn't do that. And they said, well, if you send us the questions and all this kind of stuff. So kind of went through that process, still got absolutely nothing of value. And so at that point, as far as I'm concerned, given the fact that I believe very strongly that we had something to offer to General Electric, I felt we had nothing to lose, and I felt we had an obligation. So I called essentially the senior person identified in the proposal from General Electric. I called them up direct. Explained the situation. I said, we've been working through your consultant, but frankly, we have a lot of questions. And the last thing I would want to do is put a proposal in front of you that's not worthy of your consideration. And his response was, what do you want? What do you need to know? And what's interesting, and I take this one more step, is what's interesting about it is that it would have been really easy right there to say, oh my God, I got this guy on the phone. I have to ask him a bunch of questions. But the fact is, it was a really good opportunity to hit the pause button. His name was Steve. I said, Steve, I really appreciate that. But frankly, as much as there's a couple of key questions that I could ask you right now, there's quite a few things we'd really like to learn a lot more about. And I'd like to have, our medical officer and maybe one of our finance people, underwriters, I'd like to have a couple of folks in that meeting, and you may also have a couple of folks that would be wise. Well, I also always believe in asking for something more than you're likely to get. I asked for an on-site meeting, perhaps they'd like to come out here and meet with us. He didn't think that was good. We'd go out to, Stanford, didn't think that was good. But we did have a conference call. We got 2 or 3 people from General Electric. I had several people from my call. Needless to say, we really ticked off the consultant as the result of doing this, but we won the business. And we won the business because, frankly, we put a proposal on the table that was worthy of their consideration.
There was so much brilliance in what you just said there. I would encourage people to go back and replay that. And I took a note on one thing that you said, which anybody can use anytime someone asks you for a proposal too early. And your line was, I would be reluctant to put a proposal in front of you that would not be worthy of your consideration. Man, that's just pure gold right there. Awesome. Let's go way back here for a second. One of your early days in sales or one of your early mentors, what was a piece of advice that really stuck with you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, we've hit on the fact that we probably learn a lot more from our failures, and we probably also learn a lot more from the bad managers that we work for, because the reality is there really are very few good leaders out there. But what I will tell you is, and I learned this, I had a good opportunity to spend about a month with Stephen Covey at one point, studying 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and Principle-Centered Leadership. And
name dropper.
Oh, it is a bit of a name drop, and it was a thrilling experience. But a couple things that he always commented on. One is that you lead people and you manage things. And I think that's really important from a sales perspective, is that we all really are leaders. If you're going to be effective, you have to be a leader. You also have to be a provocateur. And if people oftentimes ask me, what's the best sales book ever written? And I'll usually start with Smart Calling, because I believe that's one of the best ones.
Good answer.
But it's also true, and I'll come back to that. But I also do believe 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I mean, it really is. I mean, seek first to understand before you have to be pitching or understanding or pitching your concepts. I think those are really important words of wisdom. And the same thing is true with the concepts around win-win and synergy, and all of those 7 habits are just absolutely powerful.
I agree. Matter of fact, I always mention the second habit, which is begin with the end in mind when you're starting to plan for a sales call. Where do I want to be at the end of this call? What do I want them to do? What do I want to do? And if we don't have the end point, how are we going to be able to put together a plan?
Art, I use that all the time. In fact, any time I'm in a meeting with folks when we're preparing for some other kind of meeting, I'll frequently ask, what's the end in mind? And, it's interesting. My son is a United States Army officer, and I've actually learned a lot from him. And the military uses some, really great concepts. And one of the things that they use is this concept of an after-action review. And every time there's something material done, people check their ranks at the door. They sit down as fast as possible, might be even, standing around, while they're in the field. But they do a couple of things, and that is, what did we set out to accomplish? In addition to it, then, based on what we set out to accomplish, what did we actually accomplish? What would we do the same next time, and what would we do different as well? What's interesting is today they actually capture that it's sent to the Pentagon every single day, and within 48 hours, the Pentagon sends out after-action reports to every military unit in the world, across disciplines. But I bring up the end in mind is really important in that I think even when people do that, it's like anything else. You've got to get skilled at it. And the end in mind ultimately should be something that you can measure. I always, people say, well, we want them to know this. And my question is that, how could you ever measure whether they know something that you've said to them? Are you going to give them a survey or a quiz afterwards? So you got to be thinking about what's measurable. And of course, I always think measurable is something that's a definitive next step that you're both committed to. That's frankly, like in golf, going to set up your next shot.
Yeah, I actually teach the same thing. It's funny because as you're talking about this, I call that my primary objective, which is it's got to be action oriented. They need to be doing what are they going to be doing as a result of the call, and you can measure that. And so often I'll stop somebody before they pick up the phone and say, well, what's your objective here? Well, I want to find out when their expiration date is. Okay, and then what? Right? Okay, so I know the burning question that everybody has right now is, so you're the C-level guy, and you had numerous salespeople try to get through to you and fail miserably. So when you were in the C-suite, how did salespeople get access to you?
Well, again, it's a good question, and of course, there's a lot of moving parts to answering that. And by the way, I think it's harder than ever, very honestly, partially because of the fact that I think access is so challenging. I mean, when I was back in those roles, for the most part, people could still, if they worked hard enough, usually reach me. Get me in the office, or at that time, more often than not, you had executive assistants, and you could kind of work that angle. A lot of executives today, you can't even find their executive assistant. You can't get their telephone number. I mean, it's just very, very difficult to get access to folks. But I would start out with one of the most fundamental things that you have to do, and I think it's right out of Smart Calling, is that you have to look for things that are relevant to the core business that executive is in. And it's so important that, and I use this all the time, that if, first of all, again, using your smart calling approaches, there's so much stuff that you can learn about an organization that you're trying to do business with. And the things that I always look for is, do you have an understanding of their organizational vision, mission, and goals? And in the context of that, it then is a matter of, okay, with regard to the value that you're bringing to the table, how can you add value to their organizational vision, mission, and goals? And I'll give you a great example. In the industry that I come from, where you're selling big corporations, health insurance or different kinds of insurance products, I can tell you today, most companies still go out there and start, trying to talk. Well, talk to me about your benefits. Talk to me about your healthcare plan. What are you doing today? What's working? What's not working? And you might think of that as a really good discussion to have with a General Electric or something like that. But it's really not. Because all you're doing is you're putting yourself into the same boat that Cigna and Blue Cross and Humana and everybody else is in. What you really need to be doing is talking to them about, help me to understand, General Electric's vision today. Where's General Electric going over the next 3 to 4 years? In the context of that vision, what is your mission? What is your strategy? Because if I know that, then I really have an understanding, okay, what role does employee benefits play? What role does your medical plan play, or whatever kind of service? And if I then can understand, okay, what's the contribution that my area of expertise, my area where I'm going to be selling you a service, what's the contribution that needs to make to the core business?
And really what we're talking about here is understanding the person you're talking to, because what you're speaking about is very important at the C-suite level. The people who are asking those functional, operational type questions, those might be appropriate once we're talking to somebody who's administering the healthcare plan at the organization, somebody who's signing somebody up. So they're going to care more about the details. Where what you're discussing, the CEO, obviously, they get bored by answering those questions. And matter of fact, they're going to look at the sales rep as this is somebody that just doesn't get it.
Doesn't get it, hasn't done their homework. And again, if you can share with me, some things that you might be doing for, to a peer organization or one of my competitors or something where, the service that you're providing, the products that you're selling are actually really delivering value to them and their business success, and use that as an example as a case study. Or say, we've done some really interesting work with some other companies that we think might be relevant to you or might be applicable. I would say that's the best way to get me interested, is to bring to the table, and it kind of comes back again to fundamental things. At the end of the day, everybody that you really want to be listening to really is a consultant, is somebody that's going to give you some consultative guidance and advice. And at the end of the day, whether you end up buying for them or not, you should learn something or you should get something from that interchange.
The term trusted advisor is kind of a cliche, but as I always say, cliches are cliches for a reason. They work. So I'm not big on gimmicks or trick plays. They might work every once in a while. But what is one of the most unique offbeat things somebody did to get access to you when you're in the C-suite? It's like a lot of things. I think people, get very creative. And I kind of think of the original Wall Street movie where, Bud finds out the best cigars that Gordon Gekko likes, and he just hangs out in his office long enough to deliver them. But it was the exact same type of thing. I mean, I can tell you, I don't care how high you are in an organization, people still like to get things. And, it's not going to necessarily be a voicemail. It's probably not going to be something that in the email that you got to download or something like that. But I will say mail still works. And, people have sent me some very interesting things over the years. I remember one thing that got my attention at the time. I had younger kids, but they sent me this fabulous electric, car, remote powered car. And they were very clever. They said, we know your time is valuable. We also know this car might be of interest and value to you. If you give us 15 minutes, we'll stop by, get introduced, and we'll give you the controller. Oh, nice. And
I got the meeting. I got the car. I gave it to my son. He enjoyed it. To be honest with you, I can't recall exactly what they were pitching, but the person was very nice, and I gave them their 15 minutes, and they at least felt as though I, listened to what they had to say, or we engaged in some kind of dialogue.
There you go. Deal's a deal.
Yeah.
All right. So in addition to what you mentioned about gathering the intel and knowing about your prospect, what other advice do you have for salespeople today in our crazy busy society as far as their outreach to new prospects?
Well, again, I think there's a lot of things that you need to do. I think one, it's really interesting. I have a guy that is interestingly enough worked in my organizations, worked essentially for me 4 different times over the years, and yet he was a far better mentor to me than I ever was probably to him. But he used to have a great concept that he'd be having his sales meetings, and people would say, well, I just need to get if I get a break, I could get this deal done. And he'd go up and write on the board, BREAKS. And we'd be looking at it, and he'd go, first of all, you got to be bold. Second of all, you got to be responsible. Third is you have to be enthusiastic. You also then have to accentuate the positive. You need to be knowledgeable, and you need to be sincere. And I think if you really believe in what you're doing, you should have more courage to be bold. And I think one of the things that people need to do today is they need to challenge the status quo. They need to be provocateurs. And one of the best examples I use oftentimes is reminding people that, people say, wow, we're really customer centric. And I would tell people that is exactly the wrong thing to do. I can't tell you how often customers are wrong. more often than not, if you're going into a customer meeting, they will tell you what exactly they think they want to do. But here's the thing. If you really, again, understand their vision, mission, and goals, if you understand the contribution your product and service needs to make to effectiveness of their business, then what you really should be focusing in on, what's the solution that they need to achieve their objectives. And I can't tell you how often, I've encouraged, and I've certainly used it to myself, is to say, to the customer, I hear where you're coming from, and I think that makes some really good sense. I think you may also want to consider this. And particularly, again, if it's something that will really tie to what the results that they're trying to get. And I think the people that are best at getting into the C-suite and having that kind of dialogue are ones that are going to challenge the status quo, because here's one of the challenges that you're going to face, is that even if you get an audience with me, more than likely you're going to get an audience eventually with 2 or 3 or 4 people that report into me. And I can tell you, more often than not, they are going to come in with a bad attitude. Why is he dragging me in here? What's he going to make us do now that I didn't want to do? And they're going to try to shoot holes in so many different things. And one of the greatest things you can possibly do as a CEO is to see somebody that will, I don't mean stand up in an adversarial way, but stand up in a way of saying, I'm really in this with you, and these are the things that I really believe that you need to do as a team to be successful in the context of what you're trying to achieve. So anyway, I think being a provocateur and as opposed to being customer-centric, be solution-centric.
And actually, let me just bolt onto that a little bit here. What we don't want to do, I would assume you would agree with this, is go in and just tell somebody this is the way you should be doing it, because that contradicts what we had talked about earlier as far as asking questions. What I always like to suggest is, what do I want somebody to think and believe and feel, and then work backwards and reverse engineer that, and then come up with what questions will I need to ask in order to help somebody reach that conclusion on their own. So it's really this kind of the Socratic method of helping somebody, again, reach a decision or a thought, particularly if they don't have that going into it.
Yeah. And I think, Art, you're hitting on something that, again, I think, and this more than just about anybody else in this field, is that there really is a skill to ask good questions, but it also really takes preparation and thinking through it. And I would say from a couple of perspectives. One is you certainly don't want to be answering questions that can be answered with a yes or a no. And 2 is that you want to ask questions that, frankly, are either going to help, validate understandings that you currently have that you need to make sure are still accurate, because sometimes things change if you're going into one meeting, if you're having several meetings with somebody. 2 is getting new information in the context of, okay, what stuff don't we currently understand that we need to know more about? And then in the context of that, you're going to have some opportunity for some select messaging that might be appropriate, where you can get feedback or you can share some ideas and that sort of thing. But I believe so strongly that those things need to be thought through. And I remind people all the time, when you're preparing for a meeting, script out your questions, script out the messaging you're doing. Now, you're not going to end up reading it off of a sheet, but you should be very deliberate in those things. And it's interesting. One other program, a great program I went through years ago, it was went out to Stanford and studied situational negotiation management. And they, I think, still use a great concept called the words, the music, and the dance. And the words, of course, are, what are the words you're using? And I encourage people, this is true of everybody, but with the C-suite is there's so much rich information on CEOs. What are the words they're using? Find their publications, find their speeches, try to use words that resonate with them. But then the music is, how do you use those words? How do you use those words in asking a question? How do you use those words in communicating or messaging? And then the dance, of course, is you got to be thinking through, well, okay, if I ask this question or if I, communicate this message, what are the things that might likely happen? Well, if it's a question, they could answer it. Or if it's something that you're trying to do in terms of maybe setting up another meeting or something, they could say no. They could say yes. They could say maybe. So the dance is, what am I going to do in terms of being prepared for the various responses? So if I'm asking a question to move the ball downfield, I better be prepared to figure out how to respond. And that response, by the way, includes both your physical reaction if you're in a real meeting, as well as your verbal response.
So true. Great salespeople, good salespeople ask questions. Great salespeople are prepared for the answers that they don't want to get. and where they're going to go next. Dan, we could probably spend hours, like we have many times, talking about sales. So I want to make sure we do this again. But right now, do you know what time it is?
Your attitude will be never will, never feel. What they say, it's the art of the sales. Quote of the day.
That's right. It's time for the quote of the day. And I know Dan has at least one, maybe a couple great quotes for us. Would you mind sharing those with us, Dan?
Well, Art, as you know, I love history, and I love learning from the experiences of great leaders. And two of the leaders I admire most, Winston Churchill as well as Eisenhower, who actually worked very closely together during planning and execution of the invasion in Europe. Churchill had a great quote that I think fits with a lot of business people and salespeople, and that is, success is being able to go from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And I really do believe that's the case. I mean, it's tough being in business and selling. You're going to get a lot of rejection, and if you can't pick yourself up after failures, you're not going to be successful. But the other one by Eisenhower, I think, is really important, and I think it's very telling today. And that is, Eisenhower was notable for saying that there's always something more that you can do. And as an example, when he was planning, for the Normandy invasion, there are stories of him, getting up in the middle of the night and pacing back and forth thinking, I missed something. There must be something else I can do. And one of the reasons I bring it up today is because I think in this day and age, particularly when we rely so much upon technology, and again, whether that's anything from, our emails to texting, obviously to our cell phones and those sorts of things, is that the tendency, for most of us is to feel, well, if I sent out an email and he didn't respond, and if I sent a text, if I made a call, if I left a voicemail, I've done everything I can do. Well, the reality is you probably haven't. Maybe you need to send him that car and hold on to the remote control and see if that gets you the meeting. But the point is, I think that we got to stop hiding behind technology, because again, if we really feel good about what we're doing and we're proud of what we're representing and we believe we have added value, then I believe that we have an obligation to really bust through that complacency, bust through those barriers, and get access to the people where we think we really can help them to succeed more effectively with their vision, mission, and goals.
So true. Good enough leads to mediocrity, and that's when salespeople go downhill. And I would maintain that there are very few people, including myself, who have ever experienced all they can do. And this is evidence, and you see it and I see it all the time, where salespeople say, well, I left 2 messages, or I sent them an email. It's like, are you kidding me? Have you spoken to them?
Yeah.
Have you spoken to their assistant? Have you spoken to anybody else in their department? What else have you done? So folks, don't stop at good enough. And I believe we have an episode on that. So go back and look in the archives. All right, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell you what, why don't you tell the audience how they can connect with you and whom you personally work with, in case someone would like to take advantage of your expertise.
Yeah, so in addition to the role that I have at Base Health, and if you're interested in analytics and population health, that's the sort of thing that Base Health does and does well. You can reach me there at Hoemke at Base Health, which is HOEMKE at basehealth, all one word.com, or you can reach me at Dan at 9OARS, NINE, like the number 9, OARS, oars like paddles on a boat. I continue to do a lot of advisory work in support of companies around the United States. For those of you up in Minnesota, I have done an extensive amount of work with Health Partners and Blue Cross and other organizations like that, as they've been looking to essentially reconfigure, re-engineer their sales and account management organizations.
All right, Dan, thank you again, and we will do this again. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this today. If you're getting value from this show, please do tell 2 of your colleagues. Send them to our show site at The Art of Sales, theartofsales.com. And if you haven't already, I want to send you my free book, How to Place the Successful Sales and Prospecting Call. This is an actual 180-page Turn the Pages book that I will mail to you. It's free. We do ask you to help a little bit with the shipping, which doesn't cover all my costs. And you can get that at freesalesbook.com, freesalesbook.com. Until next time, go out and make it your best sales day ever. I'm Art Subcheck.